Little Lost Robot. When I did see Susan Calvin again, it was at the door of her office. Files were being moved out. She said, "How are your articles coming along, young man?" "Fine," I said. I had put them into shape according to my own lights, dramatized the bare bones of a recital, and added the conversation and little touches. "Would you look over them and see if I haven't been libelous or unreasonably inaccurate anywhere?" "I suppose so. Shall we retire to the executives' lounge? We can have coffee." She seemed in good humour, so I chanced it as we walked down the corridor. "I was wondering, Dr. Calvin." "Yes?" "If you would tell me more concerning the history of robotics." "Surely you have what you want, young man?" "In a way. But these incidents I have written up don't apply much to the modern world. I mean, there was only one mind-reading robot ever developed, and space stations are already outmodded and in disuse, and robot mining is taken for granted. What about interstellar travel? It's only been about 20 years since the hyperatomic motor was invented, and it's well known that it was a robotic invention. What is the truth about it?" "Interstellar travel." She was thoughtful. We were in the lounge, and I ordered a full dinner. She just had coffee. "It wasn't a simple robotic invention, you know. Not just like that. But of course, until we developed the brain, we didn't get very far. But we tried. We really tried. My first connection, directly that is, with interstellar research was in 2029, when a robot was lost." Measures on hyperbase had been taken in a sort of rattling fury, the muscular equivalent of a hysterical shriek. To itemize them in order of both chronology and desperation, they were: 1. All work on the hyperatomic drive through all the space volume occupied by the stations of the 27th asteroidal grouping came to a halt. 2. That entire volume of space was nipped out of the system, practically speaking. No one entered without permission. No one left under any conditions. 3. By special government patrol ship, Dr. Susan Calvin and Peter Bogart, respectively head psychologist and mathematical director of United States Robot and Mechanical Men Corporation, were brought to hyperbase. Susan Calvin had never left the surface of Earth before, and had no perceptible desire to leave it this time. In an age of atomic power and a clearly come-in hyperatomic drive, she remained quietly provincial. So she was dissatisfied with her trip and unconvinced of the emergency, and every line of her plain, middle-aged face showed it clearly enough during the first dinner at hyperbase. Nor did Dr. Bogart's sleek paleness abandon a certain hand-dog attitude. Nor did Major General Kalner, who headed the project, even once forget to maintain a haunted expression. In short, it was a grisly episode, that meal, and the little session of 3 that followed began in a grey, unhappy manner. Kalner, with his baldness glistening and his dress uniform oddly unsuited to the general mood, began with uneasy directness. "This is a queer story to tell, sir and madam. I want to thank you for coming on short notice and without a reason being given. We'll try to correct that now. We've lost a robot. Work has stopped, and must stop until such time as we locate it. So far we have failed, and we feel we need expert help." Perhaps the general felt his predicament anticlimactic. He continued with a note of desperation. "I needn't tell you the importance of our work here. More than 80% of last year's appropriations of scientific research have gone to us." "Why, we know that," said Bogart agreeably. "US Robots is receiving a generous rental fee for use of our robots." Susan Calvin injected a blunt, vinegary note. "What makes a single robot so important to the project? And why hasn't it been located?" The general turned his red face toward her and wet his lips quickly. "Why, in a manner of speaking, we have located it." Then, with near anguish, "Here, suppose I explain. As soon as the robot failed to report, a state of emergency was declared, and all movement off hyperbase stopped. A cargo vessel had landed the previous day and delivered us 2 robots for our laboratories. It had 62 robots of the, same type for shipment elsewhere. We are certain as to that figure. There is no question about it whatever.
Yes, and the connection.
When our missing robot failed of location anywhere, I assure you we would have found a missing blade of grass if it had been there to find. We brainstormed ourselves into counting the robots left off the cargo ship. They have 63 now.
So that the 63rd, I take it, is a missing prodigal.
Dr. Calvin's eyes darkened. Yes, but we have no way of telling which is the 63rd. There was a dead silence while the electric clock chimed 11 times, and then the robo-psychologist said,
"Very peculiar,"
and the corners of her lips moved downward.
"Peter."
She turned to her colleague with a trace of savagery.
"What's wrong here? What kind of robots are they using at hyperbase?"
Dr. Bogart hesitated and smiled feebly.
"It's been rather a matter of delicacy till now, Susan."
She spoke rapidly.
"Yes, till now. If there are 63 same-type robots, one of which is wanted and the identity of which cannot be determined, why won't any of them do? What's the idea of all this? Why have we been sent for?"
Bogart said in resigned fashion,
"If you'd give me a chance, Susan. Hyperbase happens to be using several robots whose brains were not impressioned with the entire first law of robotics."
"Aren't impressioned?" Calvin slumped back in her chair.
"I see. How many were made?"
"A few. It was on government order, and there was no way of violating the secrecy. No one was to know except the top men directly concerned. You weren't included, Susan."
"It was nothing I had anything to do with."
The General interrupted with a measure of authority. "I would like to explain that bit. I hadn't been aware that Dr. Calvin was unacquainted with the situation. I needn't tell you, Dr. Calvin, that there always has been strong opposition to robots on the planet. The only defense the government has against the fundamentalist radicals in this matter was the fact that robots are always built with unbreakable first law, which makes it impossible for them to harm human beings under any circumstances. But we had to have robots of a different nature. Just so a few of the NS2 model, the Nestors, that is, were prepared with a modified first law. To keep it quiet, all NS2s were manufactured without serial numbers. Modified members are delivered here along with a group of normal robots. And, of course, all our kind are under the strictest imprisonment never to tell of their modification to unauthorized personnel." He wore an embarrassed smile. "This has all worked out against us now."
Calvin said grimly, "Have you asked each one who it is anyhow? Certainly you are authorized."
The General nodded. "All 63 deny having worked here, and one is lying."
"Does the one you want show traces of wear? The others, I take it, are factory fresh."
"The one in question only arrived last month. It and the 2 that have just arrived were to be the last we needed. There's no perceptible wear." He shook his head slowly, and his eyes were haunted again. "Dr. Calvin, we don't dare let that ship leave. If the existence of a non-first law robot becomes general knowledge—"
There seemed no way of avoiding understatement in the conclusion. "Destroy all 36, said the robo-psychologist coldly and flatly, "and make an end of it."
Bogart drew back a corner of his mouth.
"You mean destroy $30,000 per robot? I'm afraid US robots wouldn't take that. We'd better make an effort first, Susan, before we destroy anything." "In that case," she said sharply, "I need facts. Exactly what advantage does hyperbase derive from these modified robots? What factor made them desirable, General?"
Calner ruffled his forehead and stroked it with an upward gesture of his hand. "We had trouble with our previous robots. Our men work with hard radiations, a good deal, you see. It's dangerous, of course, but reasonable precautions are taken. There have been only 2 accidents since we began, and neither was fatal. However, it was impossible to explain that to an ordinary robot. The first law states, I'll quote it, No robot may harm a human being or through inaction allow a human to come to harm. That's primary, Dr. Calvin. When it was necessary for one of our men to expose himself for a short period to a moderate gamma field, one that would have no physiological effects, the nearest robot would dash in and drag him out. If the field were exceedingly weak, it would succeed, and work could not continue till all the robots were cleared out. If the field were a trifle stronger, the robot would never reach the technician concerned, since its positronic brain would collapse under gamma radiations, and then we would be out one expensive and hard-to-replace robot. We tried arguing with them. Their point was that a human being in a gamma field was endangering its life, and that it didn't matter that he could remain there half an hour safely. Supposing, they would say, he forgot and remained an hour. They couldn't take chances. We pointed out that they were risking their lives on a wild off chance. But self-preservation is only the third law of robotics, and the first law of human safety comes first. We gave them orders. We ordered them strictly and harshly to remain out of the gamma fields at whatever cost. But obedience is only the second law of robotics, and the first law of human safety comes first. Dr. Calvin, we either had to do without robots or do something about the first law, and we made our choice.
I can't believe, said Dr. Calvin, that it was found possible to remove the first law.
It wasn't removed, it was modified, explained Kalner. Positronic brains were constructed that contained the positive aspect only of the law, which in them reads, no robot may harm a human being. That is all. They have no such compulsion to prevent one coming to harm through an extraneous agency, such as gamma rays. I state the matter correctly, Dr. Bogart?
Quite, asserted the mathematician. And that is the only difference of your robots from the ordinary NS2 model? The only difference, Peter? The only difference, Susan. She rose and spoke with finality. I intend sleeping now, and in about 8 hours I want to speak to whomever saw the robot last. And from now on, General Kalner, if I'm to take any responsibility at all for events, I want full and unquestionable control of this investigation.
Susan Calvin, except for 2 hours of resentful lassitude, experienced nothing approaching sleep. She signalled at Boggart's door at the local time of 0700, and found him also awake. He had apparently taken the trouble of transporting a dressing-gown to hyperbase with him, for he was sitting in it. He put his nail scissors down when Calvin entered. He said softly, I've been expecting you, more or less. I suppose you feel sick about all this.
I do.
Well, I'm sorry. There was no way of preventing it. When the call came from hyperbase for us, I knew something must have gone wrong with the modified nesters, but what was there to do? I couldn't break the matter to you on the trip here, as I would have liked to, because I had to be sure. The matter of the modification is top secret.
The psychologist muttered. I should have been told. US robots had no right to modify positronic brains this way, without the approval of a psychologist.
Bogart lifted his eyebrows and sighed. Be reasonable, Susan. You couldn't have influenced them in this matter. The government was bound to have its way. They want the hyperatomic drive, and the etheric physicists want robots that won't interfere with them. They were going to get them, even if it did mean twisting the first law. We had to admit it was possible from a construction standpoint, and they swore a mighty oath that they wanted only 12, that they would be used only at hyperbase, that they would be destroyed once the drive was perfected, and that full precautions would be taken. And they insisted on secrecy. And that's the situation.
Dr. Calvin spoke through her teeth. I would have resigned.
It wouldn't have helped. The government was offering the company a fortune, and threatening it with anti-robotic legislation in case of a refusal. We were stuck then, and we're badly stuck now. If this leaks out, it might hurt Kalner and the government, but it would hurt US robots a devil of a lot more.
The psychologist stared at him. Peter, don't you realize what this is all about?
Can't you understand what the removal of the first law means? It isn't just a matter of secrecy.
I know what the removal would mean. I'm not a child. It would mean complete instability, with no non-imaginary solutions to the positronic field equations.
Yes, mathematically. But can you translate that into a crude psychological thought? All normal life, Peter, consciously or otherwise, resents domination. If the domination is by an inferior, or by a supposed inferior, the resentment becomes stronger. Physically and, to an extent mentally, a robot, any robot, is superior to human beings. What makes him slavish, then? Only the first law. Why, without it, the first order you try to give a robot would result in your death. Unstable? What do you think?
Susan, said Boggart with an air of sympathetic amusement, I'll admit that this Frankenstein complex you're exhibiting has a certain justification, hence the first law in the first place. But the law, I repeat and repeat, has not been removed, merely modified.
And what about the stability of the brain?
The mathematician thrust out his lips. Decreased naturally, but it's within the border of safety. The first nesters were delivered to hyperbase 9 months ago, and nothing whatever has gone wrong until now, and even this involves merely a fear of discovery and not danger to humans.
Very well, then. We'll see what comes of the morning conference.
Boggart saw her politely to the door and grimaced eloquently as she left. He saw no reason to change his perennial opinion of her as a sour and frigidity frustration. Susan Calvin's train of thought did not include Boggart in the least. She had dismissed him years ago as a smooth and pretentious sleekness. Gerald Black had taken his degree in etheric physics a year before, and, in common with his entire generation of physicists, found himself engaged in the problem of the drive. He now made a proper addition to the general atmosphere of the meetings on hyperbase. In his stained white smock, he was half rebellious and wholly uncertain. His stocky strength seemed striving for release, as they twisted each other with nervous yanks, might have forced an iron bar out of True. Major General Kalner sat beside him. The two from US Robots faced him. Black said, I told them that I was the last to see Nestor 10 before he vanished. I take it you want to ask me about that? Dr. Calvin regarded him with interest. You sound as if you were not sure, young man. Do you know whether you were the last to see him? He worked with me, ma'am, on the field generators, and he was with me the morning of the disappearance. I don't know if anyone saw him after about noon. No one admits having done so. Do you think anyone's lying about it? I don't say, but I don't say that I want the blame of it either. His dark eyes smouldered. There's no question of blame. The robot acted as it did because of what it is. We're just trying to locate it, Mr. Black, and let's put everything else aside. Now, if you worked with the robot, you probably know it better than anyone else. Was there anything unusual about it that you noticed? Had you ever worked with robots before? I've worked with other robots we have here, the simple ones. Nothing different about the Nestors except that they're a good deal cleverer, and more annoying. Annoying? In what way? Well, perhaps it's not their fault. The work here is rough, and most of us get a little jagged. Fooling around with hyperspace isn't fun. He smiled feebly, finding pleasure in confession. We run the risk continually of blowing a hole in normal space-time fabric, and dropping right out of the universe, asteroid and all. Sounds screwy, doesn't it? Naturally, you're on edge sometimes, but these Nestors aren't. They're curious, they're calm, they don't worry. It's enough to drive you nuts at times. When you want something done in a tearing hurry, they seem to take their time. Sometimes I'd rather do without. You say they take their time. Have they ever refused an order? Oh, no. Hastily. They do it all right, but they'll tell you when they think you're wrong, though. They don't know anything about the subject but what we taught them. But that doesn't stop them. Maybe I imagine it, but the other fellows have the same trouble with the Nestors. General Kalner cleared his throat ominously. Why have no complaints reached me on the matter, Black? The young physicist reddened. We didn't really want to do without the robots, sir. And besides, we weren't certain exactly how such, minor complaints might be received. Boggart interrupted softly. Anything in particular happen the morning you last saw it?"
There was silence. With a queer motion, Calvin repressed the comment that was about to emerge from Calner, and waited patiently. Then Black spoke in blurted anger. "I had a little trouble with it. I'd broken a Kimball tube that morning, was out 5 days of work. My entire program was behind schedule. I hadn't received mail from home in a couple of weeks, and he came around wanting me to repeat an experiment I had abandoned a month ago. He was always annoying me with that subject, and I was tired of it. I told him to go away, and that's all I saw of him."
"You told him to go away?" asked Dr. Calvin with sharp interest. "In just those words? Did you say, 'go away'? Try to remember the exact words."
There was apparently an internal struggle in progress. Black cradled his forehead in a broad palm for a moment, then tore it away and said defiantly, "I said, go lose yourself." Boggart laughed for a short moment.
"And he did, eh?"
But Calvin wasn't finished. She spoke cajolingly.
"Now we're getting somewhere, Mr. Black. But exact details are important. In understanding the robot's actions, a word, a gesture, an emphasis may be everything. You couldn't have just said those 3 words, for instance, could you? By your own description, you must have been in a hasty mood. Perhaps you strengthened your speech a little."
The young man reddened. "Well, I may have called it a few things."
"Exactly what things?"
"Oh, I couldn't remember exactly. Besides, you couldn't repeat it. You know how you get when you're excited." His embarrassed laugh was almost a giggle.
I sort of have a tendency to strong language." "That's quite all right," she replied with prim severity. "At the moment, I'm a psychologist. I would like to have you repeat exactly what you said as nearly as you remember, and, even more importantly, the exact tone of voice you used."
Black looked at his commanding officer for support. Found none. His eyes grew round and appalled. "But I can't."
"You must."
"Suppose," said Boggart with ill-hidden amusement,
"you address me. You may find it easier."
The young man's scarlet face turned to Boggart. He swallowed. "I said—" His voice faded out. He tried again. "I said—" and he drew a deep breath and spewed it out hastily in one long succession of syllables. Then, in the charged air that lingered, he concluded, almost in tears,
"More or less. I don't remember the exact order of what I called him. Maybe I left out something or put in something, but that was about it."
Only the slightest flush betrayed any feeling on the part of the robopsychologist. She said,
"I am aware of the meaning of most of the terms used. The others, I suppose, are equally derogatory?"
"I'm afraid so," agreed the tormented Black.
"And in among it, you told him to lose himself." "I meant it only figuratively." "I realize that. No disciplinary action is intended, I am sure."
And Hutter glanced the general, who, 5 seconds earlier, had seemed not sure at all, nodded angrily.
"You may leave, Mr. Black. Thank you for your cooperation."
It took 5 hours for Susan Calvin to interview the 63 robots. It was 5 hours of multi-repetition, of replacement after replacement of identical robot, of questions A, B, C, D, and answers A, B, C, D, and answers A, B, C, D, of a carefully bland expression, a carefully neutral tone, a carefully friendly atmosphere, and a hidden wire recorder. The psychologist felt drained of vitality when she was finished. Boggart was waiting for her, and looked expectant as she dropped the recording spool with a clang upon the plastic of the desk. She shook her head.
"All 63 seemed the same to me. I couldn't tell,"
he said.
"You couldn't expect to tell by ear, Susan. Suppose we analyze the recordings."
Ordinarily, the mathematical interpretation of verbal reactions of robots is one of the more intricate branches of robotic analysis. It requires a staff of trained technicians and the help of complicated computing machines. Boggart knew that. Boggart stated as much, in an extreme of unshown annoyance, after having listened to each set of replies, made lists of word deviations, and graphs of the intervals of responses.
There are no anomalies present, Susan. The variations in words and the time reactions are within the limits of ordinary frequency groupings. We need finer methods. They must have computers here, no?
He frowned and nibbled delicately at a thumbnail.
We can't use computers. Too much danger of leakage. Or maybe if we...
Dr. Calvin stopped him with an impatient gesture. Please, Peter. This isn't one of your petty laboratory problems. If we can't determine the modified Nestor by some gross indifference that we can see with the naked eye, one that there is no mistake about, we're out of luck. The danger of being wrong, and of letting him escape, is otherwise too great. It's not enough to point out a miniature irregularity in a graph. I tell you, if that's all I've got to go on, I'd destroy them all just to be certain. Have you spoken to the other modified Nestors?
Yes, I have, snapped back Boggart. And there's nothing wrong with them. They're above normal in friendliness, if anything. They answered my questions, displayed pride in their knowledge, except the two new ones that haven't had time to learn their etheric physics. They laughed rather good-naturedly at my ignorance in some of the specializations here. He shrugged. I suppose that forms some sort of basic for resentment toward them on the part of the technicians here. The robots are perhaps too willing to impress you with their greater knowledge.
Can you try a few planar reactions to see if there has been any change, any deterioration in their mental setup since manufacture?
I haven't yet, but I will.
He shook a slim finger at her.
You're losing your nerve, Susan. I don't see what it is you're dramatizing. They're essentially harmless.
They are. Calvin took fire. They are. Do you realize one of them is lying? One of the 63 robots I have just interviewed has deliberately lied to me after the strictest injection to tell the truth. The abnormality indicated is horribly deep-seated and horribly frightening. Peter Boggart felt his teeth harden against each other. He said,
Not at all. Look, Nestor 10 was given orders to lose himself. Those orders were expressed in a maximum urgency of the person most authorized to command him. You can't counteract that order, either by superior agency or superior right of command. Naturally, the robot will attempt to defend the carrying out of its orders. In fact, objectively, I admire its ingenuity. How better can a robot lose himself than hide himself among a group of similar robots?
Yes, you would admire it. I've detected amusement in you, Peter. Amusement and an appalling lack of understanding. Are you a roboticist, Peter? Those robots attach importance to what they consider superiority. You've just said as much yourself. Subconsciously, they feel humans to be inferior, and the first law which protects us from them is imperfect. They're unstable. And here we have a young man ordering a robot to leave him, to lose himself, with every verbal appearance of revulsion, disdain, and disgust. Granted, that robot must follow orders, but subconsciously there is resentment. It will become more important than ever for it to prove that it is superior despite the horrible names it was called. It may become so important that what's left of the first law won't be enough.
How on Earth, or anywhere in the solar system, Susan, is a robot going to know the meaning of the assorted strong language used upon it? Obscenity is not one of those things impressioned upon the brain.
Original impressionment is not everything, Calvin snarled at him. Robots have learning capacity, you fool! And Boggart knew that she had really lost her temper. She continued hastily. Don't you suppose he could tell from the tone used that the words weren't complimentary? Don't you suppose he's heard the words used before, and noted upon what occasions?
Well then, shouted Boggart, will you kindly tell me one way in which a modified robot can harm a human being, no matter how offended it is, no matter how sick with desire to prove superiority?
If I tell you one way, will you keep quiet?
Yes.
They were leaning across the table at each other, angry eyes nailed together. The psychologist said, If a modified robot were to drop a heavy weight upon a human being, he would not be breaking the first law. If he did so with the knowledge that his strength and reaction speed would be sufficient to snatch the weight away before it struck the man.
However, once the weight left his fingers, he would be no longer the active medium. Only the blind force of gravity would be that. The robot could then change his mind and merely by inaction allow the weight to strike. The modified first law allows that.
That's an awful stretch of imagination.
That's what my profession requires sometimes. Peter, let's not quarrel. Let's work. You know the exact nature of the stimulus that caused the robot to lose himself? You have the records of his original mental makeup. I want you to tell me how possible it is for our robot to do the sort of thing I just talked about. Not the specific instance, mind you, but the whole class of response. And I want it done quickly.
And meanwhile,
we'll have to try performance tests directly on the response to first law.
Gerald Black, at his own request, was supervising the mushrooming wooden partitions that were springing up in a Belian circle on the vaulted third floor of Radiation Building 2. The labourers worked, in the main, silently, but more than one was openly a wonder at the 63 photocells that required installation. One of them sat down near Black, removed his hat, and wiped his forehead thoughtfully with a freckled forearm. Black nodded at him. "How's it doing, Valensky?" Valensky shrugged and fired a cigar. "Smooth as butter. What's going on anyway, Doc? First there's no work for 3 days, and then we have this mess of jiggers." He leaned backward on his elbow and puffed smoke. Black twitched his eyebrows. "A couple of robot men came over from Earth. Remember the trouble we had with robots running into the gamma fields before we pounded into their skulls that they weren't to do that? Yeah, didn't we get new robots? We got some replacement robots, but mostly it was a job of indoctrination. Anyway, the people who make them want to figure out robots that aren't hit so bad by gamma rays. Sure seems funny, though, to stop all the work on the drive for this robot deal. I thought nothing was allowed to stop the drive." "Well, it's the fellows upstairs that have the say on it. Me, I just do as I'm told. Probably all the matter of pull." "Here." The electrician jerked a smile and winked a wise eye. "Somebody knew someone in Washington. But as long as my pay comes through on the dot, I shouldn't worry. The drive's none of my affair. What are they going to do here?" "You're asking me? They bought a mess of robots with them, over 60, and they're going to measure reactions. That's all my knowledge. How long will it take?" "I wish I knew." "Well," Walensky said with heavy sarcasm, "as long as they dish me my money, they can play games all they want." Black felt quietly satisfied. Let the story spread. It was harmless, and near enough to the truth to take the fangs out of curiosity. End of Part 1.